The shovel struck something hard beneath the frost-covered earth. It was November 1889, 52 years after the last reported sighting of what locals had whispered about as the Quiet Brotherhood, a construction crew breaking ground for a new textile mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts, had uncovered what appeared to be a hidden chamber beneath the old Pemberton estate, a mansion that had stood empty since 1838. What they found in that underground room would resurrect memories of one of New England's most disturbing and forgotten chapters, a secret society that practiced rituals so unsettling that even decades later, families refused to speak of them. Arranged in neat rows were 13 wooden coffins, each bearing a brass nameplate with 2 names, one male, one female. But these were not ordinary burial chambers. Each coffin contained the remains of a young man alongside a wedding dress, a ring, and documents that would reveal the true scope of an organization that had operated in the shadows of industrial New England. The discovery would force investigators to confront a truth that respectable society had tried to bury. That in 1837, beneath the smoke and prosperity of America's growing industrial towns, a brotherhood of influential men had conducted ceremonies that bound living girls in marriage to the dead. Before we continue, if you enjoy uncovering these dark and forgotten chapters of history, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us bring more of these stories to light. The year 1837 found New England in the throes of industrial transformation. The Merrimack River powered dozens of textile mills, drawing young women from farms across the region to work 14-hour days in the humid, lint-filled air of factory floors. These mill girls, as they were known, lived in company boarding houses under strict supervision, their wages sent home to support struggling rural families. It was a world of rigid schedules and moral oversight, where a girl's reputation was her most valuable possession, and any deviation from proper conduct could mean dismissal and disgrace. Into this ordered world came whispers of something that defied both reason and Christian doctrine. The first reports emerged in Lowell, Massachusetts, in early February 1837. Miss Eleanor Whitman, who ran a boarding house for mill girls on Dutton Street, noticed that one of her charges, 16-year-old Sarah Caldwell, had begun experiencing what she described as night terrors. The girl would wake screaming about cold hands and promises made in darkness. More troubling still, Sarah had begun wearing a thin gold band on her ring finger, jewelry she could never have afforded on her mill wages. When Miss Whitman questioned Sarah about the ring, the girl's response chilled her. "I am married now," Sarah whispered, her eyes distant and unfocused, "to one who waits for me in the quiet place." She would say nothing more, but Miss Whitman noticed that Sarah had grown pale and thin, picking at her food and starting at shadows. Most disturbing of all, the girl had begun speaking to empty corners of her room, addressing someone she called "my husband James." Similar reports began filtering in from other boarding houses throughout Lowell. Girls who had been cheerful and industrious suddenly became withdrawn and fearful. They spoke in hushed tones of being chosen and called to serve. Some displayed rings they claimed were wedding bands. Others showed small daguerreotypes of young men they insisted were their husbands, though the images appeared to be post-mortem photographs, the kind taken of the recently deceased as final mementos for grieving families. The pattern was always the same. A mill girl would disappear for 2 or 3 nights, returning pale and changed, often clutching some token, a ring, a photograph, a pressed flower. When questioned, they would speak of ceremonies conducted in darkness, of vows spoken over candlelight, of being united with souls who had passed beyond the veil. Their descriptions were fragmentary and often contradictory, as if they struggled to remember or had been instructed to forget. What made these accounts particularly unsettling was the caliber of men allegedly involved. Unlike the typical criminal organizations that preyed on vulnerable populations, this society, which came to be known as the Quiet Brotherhood, was said to include some of New England's most respectable citizens. Mill owners, physicians, ministers, and merchants were rumored rumored to participate in rituals that violated every principle of Christian morality and civilized society. Dr. Cornelius Ashworth, who served as physician to several mill companies in Lowell, first encountered the phenomenon when treating Sarah Caldwell for what appeared to be a severe case of nervous exhaustion. During his examination, he discovered that the girl bore strange marks on her arms, small puncture wounds that had healed but left distinctive scars. When he inquired about their origin, Sarah became agitated and began speaking rapidly about the binding ceremony and blood mixed with wine. Dr. Ashworth's medical notes, discovered years later among his papers, provide one of the few contemporary accounts of the Brotherhood's practices. According to Sarah's fragmented testimony, she had been approached by a well-dressed gentleman outside the mill gates one evening in January. He told her she had been selected for a great honor and invited her to accompany him to what he described as a gathering of souls seeking reunion. Curious and flattered by the attention, Sarah agreed to meet the man the following evening. He led her through the winding streets of Lowell to an elegant carriage waiting in the shadows behind St. Anne's Episcopal Church. Inside the carriage, she was joined by two other mill girls, both of whom seemed oddly calm and compliant. The carriage traveled for what felt like hours through the countryside, finally stopping at what appeared to be an abandoned farmhouse several miles outside the city. The farmhouse, Sarah recalled, was larger than it appeared from the outside. A hidden entrance led to a series of underground chambers that had been converted into what could only be described as a chapel. The walls were draped in black cloth, and dozens of candles provided flickering illumination. At the center of the main chamber stood an altar, and beside the altar, an open coffin containing the body of a young man dressed in a black suit. Sarah's account becomes more disturbed and fragmented at this point. She described being led to the coffin by men wearing dark robes and masks that concealed their faces. The body, she said, was that of James Morrison, a mill worker who had died in a factory accident 3 weeks earlier. She recognized him because she had seen his funeral procession pass by her boarding house. What happened next defied both law and nature. According to Sarah, she was made to stand beside the coffin while one of the robed figures, a man whose voice she recognized but could not place, conducted what appeared to be a wedding ceremony. Vows were spoken, rings were exchanged, and Sarah was instructed to place her hand on the corpse's chest while promising to honor and cherish her deceased husband until her own death would reunite them. The ceremony concluded with Sarah drinking from a silver chalice filled with what tasted like wine mixed with something bitter and metallic. She remembered little after that, waking the next morning in her own bed at the boarding house, with no clear memory of how she had returned. Only the ring on her finger and the strange puncture wounds on her arms provided evidence that the experience had been real. Dr. Ashworth's attempts to investigate Sarah's claims led him to discover that James Morrison's grave in Lowell Cemetery had been disturbed shortly after his burial. The groundskeeper, when questioned, admitted that he had noticed the earth appeared to have been moved, but he had attributed this to natural settling. More disturbing still, Dr. Ashworth learned that Morrison was not the only recent burial to show signs of disturbance. At least 6 graves of young men who had died in the previous months showed evidence of nocturnal excavation. As word of these discoveries spread through Lowell's medical and religious communities, a pattern began to emerge. The Quiet Brotherhood appeared to be systematically exhuming the bodies of young men who had died unmarried, victims of industrial accidents, disease, or other misfortunes that cut short their lives before they could establish families. These corpses were then used in elaborate ceremonies designed to unite them in marriage with living mill girls. The selection process for the girls seemed to follow specific criteria. All were between the ages of 15 and 20. All were employed in the mills, and all came from rural families with limited means and social connections. They were, in essence, the most vulnerable members of an already vulnerable population. Young women, far from home, dependent on their wages for survival, and lacking the social protections that might have shielded them from exploitation. By spring of 1837, reports of similar activities had spread beyond Lowell to other mill towns towns throughout Massachusetts and New Hampshire. In Manchester, New Hampshire, the disappearance of 3 mill girls over the course of 2 weeks prompted local authorities to organize search parties. The girls were found 3 days later, wandering along the Merrimack River in their nightclothes, apparently unharmed, but unable to provide coherent accounts of where they had been. One of the girls, 17-year-old Mary Catherine O'Brien, had been employed at the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company and was known for her reliability and good character. When she returned from her unexplained absence, her fellow workers noticed that she had become withdrawn and fearful. She jumped at sudden noises, refused to work night shifts, and was often seen staring out the mill windows as if watching for someone. Mary Catherine's boarding housekeeper, Miss Prudence Hartwell, became concerned when the girl began talking in her sleep. According to Miss Hartwell's later testimony, Mary Catherine would carry on lengthy conversations with someone she addressed as "my dear husband Thomas," often weeping and asking forgiveness for some unnamed transgression. When questioned about these nocturnal conversations, Mary Catherine would claim no memory of them. The breakthrough in understanding the Brotherhood's operations came through an unexpected source: a 12-year-old boy named Timothy Fletcher, whose father worked as a groundskeeper at Pine Grove Cemetery in Manchester. Timothy had developed the habit of exploring the cemetery grounds after dark, fascinated by the elaborate monuments and mausoleums that marked the graves of the city's wealthy families. On the night of May 15, 1837, Timothy witnessed what he later described as a procession of ghosts moving through the cemetery. Hiding behind a large granite monument, he watched as a group of robed figures carrying lanterns made their way to a recently dug grave. The boy observed as they carefully excavated the coffin of one Thomas Brennan, a young Irish immigrant who had died of consumption 2 weeks earlier. Timothy's account, recorded by his father and later presented to local authorities, provides the most detailed description of the Brotherhood's grave-robbing activities. The robed figures worked with practiced efficiency, using specialized tools to minimize damage to the coffin and surrounding earth. Once the coffin was exhumed, they loaded it onto a horse-drawn wagon and departed, leaving the gravesite carefully restored to avoid detection. Intrigued and terrified by what he had witnessed, Timothy began conducting regular nighttime surveillance of the cemetery. Over the following weeks, he observed similar exhumations of 3 other recently buried young men. In each case, the operation was conducted with the same methodical precision, suggesting that the Brotherhood had extensive experience in such activities. Timothy's father, Patrick Fletcher, initially dismissed his son's stories as the product of an overactive imagination fueled by too many Gothic novels. However, when the boy provided accurate descriptions of specific grave sites and burial details that he could not have known otherwise, Patrick began to take the accounts seriously. His decision to investigate led to one of the most shocking discoveries in the Brotherhood's history. Patrick Fletcher's examination of the disturbed graves revealed that the exhumations had been conducted with surgical precision. The coffins had been carefully removed, opened, and their contents examined before being reburied. In several cases, personal items had been removed from the bodies: rings, watches, and other objects that might serve as tokens or relics in the Brotherhood ceremonies. More disturbing still, Patrick discovered that the cemetery's burial records had been altered. Entries for the exhumation bodies showed discrepancies in dates and details that suggested someone with access to official documents had been providing information to the Brotherhood. This implied that the organization had infiltrated not only the local medical and religious establishments, but also the administrative systems that govern death and burial. The scope of the conspiracy became apparent when Patrick Fletcher shared his discoveries with Dr. Samuel Whitmore, Manchester's most prominent physician. Dr. Whitmore revealed that he had been treating an increasing number of young women for what he described as nervous disorders of unknown origin. These patients, all mill workers, exhibited symptoms that included severe anxiety, sleeplessness, and what appeared to be traumatic memories that they could not fully articulate. Dr. Whitmore's patient records, preserved in the archives of the New Hampshire Historical Society, provide clinical documentation of the Brotherhood's impact on its victims. The women he treated displayed a consistent pattern of symptoms. They spoke of obligations to the departed, experienced vivid dreams involving deceased young men, and often exhibited signs of what modern psychology would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. One patient, identified in Dr. Whitmore's notes only as Miss R., provided an account that corroborated many of Timothy Fletcher's observations. She described being taken to an underground chamber where she participated in what she called the joining ceremony. The chamber, she said, contained multiple coffins arranged in a circle around a central altar. Each coffin held the body of a young man, and each was attended by a living woman who had been selected for union. According to Miss R's testimony, the ceremony involved elaborate rituals designed to bind the living women to their deceased husbands. The women were required to exchange vows with the corpses, accept rings that had been blessed by the Brotherhood's leaders, and consume a mixture of wine and what she believed was human blood drawn from the bodies. The ceremony concluded with each woman being required to spend the night lying beside her assigned corpse, a practice that the Brotherhood claimed would facilitate spiritual communion between the living and the dead. The psychological impact of these experiences was devastating. Miss R and other victims suffered from recurring nightmares, panic attacks, and a persistent sense that they were being watched or followed. Many believed that they were truly married to the dead men and that their earthly lives were now forfeit to their deceased husbands. Some refused to consider marriage to living men, convinced that such unions would constitute adultery and damn their souls to eternal punishment. As reports of the Brotherhood's activities spread throughout New England, public outrage began to build. Religious leaders denounced the ceremonies as blasphemous mockeries of Christian marriage, while civic authorities struggled to understand how such an organization could operate with apparent impunity. The mill owners, concerned about the impact on their workforce, began implementing stricter supervision of their female employees. But these measures proved largely ineffective against an organization that seemed to have connections throughout respectable society. The turning point came in August 1837, when a farmer named Ezekiel Morse made a discovery that would finally expose the Brotherhood's operations to public scrutiny. Morse, who owned a small farm outside Manchester, New Hampshire, had been troubled by strange lights and sounds emanating from an abandoned meeting house on the edge of his property. The building, which had once served a small Methodist congregation, had been empty for nearly a decade after the congregation moved to a larger facility in town. On the night of August 23, 1837, Morse decided to investigate the disturbances that had been keeping him awake for weeks. Armed with a lantern and accompanied by his eldest son, he approached the meeting house and discovered that what appeared to be a religious service was taking place inside. Through gaps in the building's weathered boards, he observed a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The interior of the meeting house had been transformed into an elaborate ceremonial chamber. Black drapery covered the walls, and dozens of candles provided flickering illumination. At the center of the space stood an ornate altar, and arranged around it were 7 open coffins, each containing the body of a young man dressed in formal attire. Beside each coffin stood a young woman in a white dress, and surrounding the entire scene were perhaps 20 men in dark robes and masks. Morse watched in horror as one of the robed figures, speaking in what sounded like Latin, conducted what could only be described as a mass wedding ceremony. The women were instructed to place rings on the fingers of the corpses, to kiss their cold lips, and to pledge their eternal devotion to their deceased husbands. The ceremony concluded with each woman drinking from a shared chalice, while the robed figures chanted what Morse later described as words that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. Overcome by what he had witnessed, Morse fled with his son to alert the authorities. By dawn, a group of local constables and concerned citizens had surrounded the meeting house. However, when they entered the building, they found it empty except for a single young woman who lay unconscious beside one of the coffins. The robed figures had vanished, apparently through a hidden passage that led to a network of underground tunnels. The woman, later identified as 18-year-old Rebecca Thornton, a mill worker from Lowell, was in a state of severe shock. When she regained consciousness, she was unable or unwilling to provide details about the ceremony or identify any of the men who had participated. She claimed to remember nothing after accepting an invitation to attend what she had been told was a spiritual gathering in Manchester. However, the evidence left behind in the meeting house provided investigators with their first concrete proof of the Brotherhood's activities. The coffins contained the bodies of 7 young men, all of whom had been reported as missing from various cemeteries throughout New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Personal effects found at the scene included robes bearing mysterious symbols, ritual implements made of silver and gold, and documents written in a coded script that would take months to decipher. Most significantly, investigators discovered a leather-bound ledger that appeared to contain records of the Brotherhood ceremonies dating back several years. The entries, written in the same coded script, documented dozens of unions between living women and deceased men. Each entry included the names of the participants, the date and location of the ceremony, and notes about the spiritual progress of the unions. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our work, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. The discovery at the Manchester Meeting House triggered a wave of investigations throughout New England. Constables and sheriff's deputies raided suspected Brotherhood meeting places in dozens of towns, uncovering evidence of an organization far more extensive and sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Hidden chambers were found beneath churches, private homes, and commercial buildings, many containing altars, coffins, and ritual implements similar to those discovered in Manchester. The scope of the conspiracy became apparent as investigators traced connections between the various meeting places. The Brotherhood appeared to operate as a network of semi-autonomous cells, each responsible for activities in a specific geographic area, but all following the same basic ritual practices. Communication between cells was maintained through an elaborate system of coded messages and symbolic markers that allowed members to identify each other and coordinate activities across state lines. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery that the Brotherhood had maintained detailed records of its victims. In a hidden vault beneath a mansion in Salem, Massachusetts, investigators found files containing personal information about hundreds of young women throughout New England. The files included details about the women's employment, living situations, family backgrounds, and psychological profiles that had apparently been compiled to identify the most suitable candidates for the Brotherhood ceremonies. The selection criteria revealed the calculated nature of the Brotherhood's activities. The organization specifically targeted young women who were isolated from their families, financially vulnerable, and psychologically susceptible to manipulation. Mill girls were ideal victims because they lived far from home, earned low wages that made them dependent on their employers, and had limited social connections that might provide protection or support. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated methods the Brotherhood used to approach and recruit its victims. Members posed as wealthy benefactors offering employment opportunities, religious leaders providing spiritual guidance, or romantic suitors promising marriage and social advancement. Once a victim was identified and approached, she was gradually drawn into the organization through a series of seemingly innocent social gatherings that served to assess her suitability and break down her psychological defenses. The actual ceremonies, according to testimony from victims who were eventually willing to speak, followed a consistent pattern designed to maximize psychological impact and ensure compliance. Victims were typically transported to remote locations at night, often after being given substances that impaired their judgment and memory. The elaborate ritual settings, with their candles, incense, and religious symbolism, created an atmosphere of mystical significance that made resistance seem not only futile, but sacrilegious. The psychological manipulation continued throughout the ceremonies themselves. Victims were told that they had been chosen for a great honor, that their participation would bring salvation to the souls of the deceased men, and that resistance would result in terrible consequences for both themselves and their families. The combination of religious authority, social pressure, and implied threats proved effective in securing compliance from even the most reluctant participants. The aftermath of the ceremonies was equally calculated to ensure silence and continued control. Victims were given tokens of their marriages, rings, photographs, or personal items that had belonged to the deceased men, and told that these objects bound them spiritually to their dead husbands. They were warned that speaking about the ceremonies would break these sacred bonds and result in eternal damnation for both themselves and the souls they had been chosen to help. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the Brotherhood's activities extended beyond the ritual marriages themselves. The organization appeared to be involved in a complex network of grave robbing, body trafficking, and occult practices that stretched across multiple states. Bodies exhumed for use in ceremonies were often subjected to various forms of preservation and preparation, suggesting that the Brotherhood had access to advanced medical knowledge and facilities. The financial aspects of the organization were equally sophisticated. The Brotherhood appeared to be funded through contributions from wealthy members, many of whom held prominent positions in business, politics, and religious institutions. These contributions supported not only the organization's operational expenses, but also elaborate facilities and equipment that would have been far beyond the means of a typical criminal organization. The investigation revealed that the Brotherhood owned or controlled numerous properties throughout New England, many of which had been purchased through shell companies and holding arrangements that concealed the true ownership. These properties included not only meeting places and ceremonial chambers, but also facilities for storing and preparing bodies, safe houses for hiding victims during ceremonies, and warehouses for storing the organization's extensive collection of ritual implements and regalia. Perhaps most shocking of all was the discovery that the Brotherhood had infiltrated numerous legitimate institutions throughout the region. Members held positions in local governments, police departments, medical establishments, and religious organizations, allowing the Brotherhood to operate with virtual impunity while suppressing investigations and protecting its activities from public scrutiny. The extent of this institutional corruption became apparent when several prominent citizens were arrested in connection with the Brotherhood's activities. Among those charged were Dr. Nathaniel Prescott, a respected physician and deacon of the First Congregational Church of Lowell, Judge Horatio Blackwood, who had served on the Massachusetts Superior Court for over a decade, and Colonel James Whitfield, a wealthy mill owner and prominent member of Manchester society. The arrests sent shockwaves through New England's social and political establishments. The idea that such respected members of society could be involved in activities so fundamentally at odds with Christian morality and civilized behavior challenged basic assumptions about the nature of authority and respectability. Public trust in institutions that had previously been considered beyond reproach was severely undermined, leading to calls for comprehensive reforms and investigations. However, the legal proceedings against the Brotherhood's members proved frustratingly difficult to pursue. The organization's elaborate security measures and the traumatized state of its victims made it nearly impossible to gather the evidence necessary for successful prosecutions. Many victims were too frightened or psychologically damaged to testify, while others had been so effectively manipulated that they continued to believe in the legitimacy of their marriages to the dead. The coded documents and ritual implements seized during the raids provided evidence of the Brotherhood's activities, but proving the specific involvement of individual members remained challenging. The organization's cell structure and use of masks and robes during ceremonies made identification difficult, while the destruction of records and the flight of key members further complicated the investigation. Most frustrating of all was the discovery that the Brotherhood appeared to have anticipated the investigation and taken steps to protect its most important members. By the time arrest warrants were issued, many of the organization's leaders had disappeared, apparently fleeing to other states or even other countries where they could continue their activities beyond the reach of New England authorities. The few members who were successfully prosecuted received sentences that many considered inadequate, given the severity of their crimes. Dr. Prescott was convicted of grave robbing and sentenced to 5 years in prison, while Judge Blackwood was found guilty of conspiracy and sentenced to 3 years. Colonel Whitfield, despite overwhelming evidence of his involvement, was acquitted after a trial that many observers believed was influenced by his wealth and social connections. The light sentences and frequent acquittals reinforced public suspicions that the Brotherhood's influence extended even into the courtrooms where its members were being tried. Rumors circulated that judges, prosecutors, and jury members had been bribed or threatened, while others suggested that the Brotherhood's network of influential supporters was working behind the scenes to minimize the consequences of exposure. As the legal proceedings dragged on through 1838 and 1839, public attention gradually shifted to other matters. The economic panic of 1837 had created widespread unemployment and social unrest, while political tensions over slavery and territorial expansion dominated newspaper headlines. The Brotherhood's activities, shocking as they had been, began to fade from public memory as more immediate concerns demanded attention. This shift in public focus allowed the Brotherhood to begin rebuilding its operations, though on a much smaller and more secretive scale than before. Reports of suspicious activities continued to surface sporadically throughout the 1840s and 1850s, suggesting that the organization had not been completely destroyed, but had simply adapted to the new environment of increased scrutiny and public awareness. The long-term impact of the Brotherhood's activities on its victims remained largely hidden from public view. Many of the women who had participated in the ceremonies continued to suffer from psychological trauma that would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They struggled with depression, anxiety, and a persistent sense of spiritual contamination that made it difficult for them to form normal relationships or integrate into society. Some victims never recovered from their experiences, spending their remaining years in mental institutions or living as recluses, unable to function in normal society. Others managed to rebuild their lives, but carried the psychological scars of their encounters with the Brotherhood until their deaths. A few found solace in religion, joining evangelical movements or religious communities that promised redemption and spiritual healing. The families of victims also suffered lasting consequences from the Brotherhood's activities. Parents struggled with guilt and shame over their inability to protect their daughters, while siblings and relatives faced social stigma associated with the family's connection to the scandal. Many families left New England entirely, seeking fresh starts in Western territories where their histories were unknown. The mill towns, where the Brotherhood had been most active, experienced significant social and economic disruption as a result of the scandal. The revelation that respected community leaders had been involved in such activities undermined social cohesion and trust, while the negative publicity associated with the Brotherhood's activities made it more difficult for mill owners to recruit workers from rural areas. Some mills were forced to implement extensive security measures and supervision systems to reassure parents that their daughters would be safe, while others relocated their operations to areas where the Brotherhood's activities had not been exposed. The additional costs and complications associated with these measures contributed to the economic difficulties that many New England textile companies faced during the late 1830s and early 1840s. The religious implications of the Brotherhood's activities also had lasting effects on New England's spiritual landscape. The revelation that ministers and church leaders had been involved in practices that directly contradicted Christian doctrine led to widespread questioning of religious authority and traditional beliefs. Some congregations split apart as members debated the implications of their leaders' involvement, while others underwent extensive reforms designed to prevent similar infiltration in the future. The scandal also contributed to the growth of more evangelical and emotionally expressive forms of Christianity, as believers sought spiritual experiences that seemed more authentic and less susceptible to the kind of ritualistic corruption that the Brotherhood represented. Revival movements and camp meetings became increasingly popular, offering alternatives to the formal, institutional religion that had proven vulnerable to the Brotherhood's influence. Despite the extensive investigations and public exposure, many questions about the Brotherhood's activities remained unanswered. The organization's origins and early development were never fully documented, leaving historians to speculate about how such a sophisticated and widespread conspiracy could have developed without detection. The true extent of the Brotherhood's membership and activities may never be known, as many records were destroyed and participants took their secrets to their graves. The fate of the Brotherhood's leaders who escaped prosecution also remained a mystery. Some reports suggested that they had fled to Europe, where they continued their activities among expatriate American communities, while others claimed that they had moved to frontier territories where law enforcement was minimal and social oversight was lacking. Occasional reports of similar activities in other parts of the United States during the mid-19th century suggested that the Brotherhood's influence may have spread far beyond New England. Perhaps most troubling of all was the possibility that the Brotherhood's core beliefs and practices had survived its exposure and continued to influence other occult and spiritualist movements throughout the 19th century. The period saw a significant increase in interest in spiritualism, seances, and communication with the dead, some of which bore suspicious similarities to the Brotherhood's rituals and beliefs. The Brotherhood's emphasis on bridging the gap between the living and the dead through ritual marriage found echoes in various spiritualist practices that became popular during the 1840s and 1850s. While most of these movements were relatively benign compared to the Brotherhood's activities, the underlying concepts and some of the ritual elements suggested possible connections to the earlier organization. Modern historians studying the Brotherhood have been struck by the sophistication of its operations and the extent of its influence throughout New England society. The organization's ability to maintain secrecy while conducting elaborate ceremonies involving dozens of participants suggests a level of organizational skill that was unusual for criminal enterprises of the period. The Brotherhood's success in recruiting members from the highest levels of society also indicates an understanding of social psychology and group dynamics that was remarkably advanced for its time. Some researchers have suggested that the Brotherhood may have been influenced by European occult traditions that were being imported to America during the early 19th century. The organization's ritual practices and symbolic systems showed similarities to various European secret societies and mystical orders, while its emphasis on death and spiritual communion reflected themes that were common in European Gothic literature and Romantic philosophy. The Brotherhood's targeting of mill girls also reflected a sophisticated understanding of social and economic vulnerabilities that characterized early industrial society. The organization's leaders clearly recognized that the rapid social changes associated with industrialization had created new categories of vulnerable individuals who could be exploited with relative impunity. The mill girls' isolation from traditional family and community support systems made them ideal victims for an organization that depended on secrecy and psychological manipulation. The psychological techniques used by the Brotherhood to control its victims also demonstrated an understanding of human psychology that was remarkably advanced for the 1830s. The organization's use of religious symbolism, social pressure, and implied threats to secure compliance from its victims reflected principles that would not be formally recognized by psychology until decades later. The Brotherhood's success in maintaining control over its victims long after the initial ceremonies suggested an understanding of trauma and memory that was far ahead of contemporary medical knowledge. The investigation of the Brotherhood's activities also revealed the limitations of law enforcement and legal systems in dealing with organized crime during the early 19th century. The organization's use of multiple jurisdictions, false identities, and corrupt officials to avoid prosecution highlighted weaknesses in American legal institutions that would not be adequately addressed until the development of federal law enforcement agencies later in the century. The Brotherhood's case also illustrated the challenges that early American society faced in balancing individual rights with collective security. The organization's ability to operate under the protection of religious freedom and property rights demonstrated how fundamental American principles could be exploited by those with criminal intent. The difficulty that authorities faced in prosecuting Brotherhood members without violating constitutional protections highlighted tensions between liberty and order that continue to influence American legal and political debates. As the 19th century progressed and memories of the Brotherhood began to fade, the organization's activities took on aspects of folklore and legend. Stories about the marriage to the dead ceremonies became part of New England's oral tradition, often embellished with supernatural elements that obscured the historical reality of what had actually occurred. Some accounts claimed that the Brotherhood's victims had actually been possessed by the spirits of their dead husbands, while others suggested that the ceremonies had successfully created genuine spiritual bonds between the living and the dead. These folkloric interpretations of the Brotherhood's activities reflected broader cultural anxieties about death, sexuality, and social change that characterized American society during the 19th century. The rapid pace of industrialization and urbanization had disrupted traditional social relationships and created new forms of vulnerability that many Americans struggled to understand and address. The Brotherhood's activities, however disturbing, provided a concrete focus for these more abstract concerns about the direction of American society. The story of the Brotherhood also became incorporated into the growing body of American Gothic literature, influencing writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, and later authors who explored themes of hidden evil within respectable society. The organization's combination of social respectability and moral corruption provided a template for literary villains who would become staples of American horror and mystery fiction. By the time of the Civil War, active memory of the Brotherhood's activities had largely faded from public consciousness, surviving mainly in family stories and local legends. The massive social disruption caused by the war and its aftermath provided new concerns that overshadowed the earlier scandal, while the continued industrialization of New England created social conditions that made the Brotherhood's particular form of exploitation less feasible. However, the discovery of the hidden chamber beneath the Pemberton estate in 1889 brought renewed attention to the Brotherhood's activities and their lasting impact on New England society. The physical evidence found in the chamber provided confirmation of many details that had previously been dismissed as folklore or exaggeration, while the careful documentation of the ceremonies revealed the full extent of the organization's sophistication and cruelty. The 1889 discovery also prompted a new round of investigations into the Brotherhood's activities and their connection to other mysterious events throughout 19th century New England. Researchers began to identify patterns of disappearances, unexplained deaths, and social disruption that might be connected to the Brotherhood's continued activities long after its supposed dissolution in the late 1830s. Some evidence suggested that the Brotherhood, rather than disappearing entirely, had evolved into a more decentralized network of individuals and small groups who continued to practice modified versions of the original ceremonies. These later activities appeared to be smaller in scale and more carefully hidden than the elaborate ceremonies of the 1830s, but they maintained the same basic elements of grave robbing, ritual marriage, and psychological manipulation that had characterized the original organization. The persistence of brotherhood-related activities into the later 19th century raised troubling questions about the effectiveness of the original investigation and prosecution efforts. If the organization had indeed survived and continued its activities, it suggested that the legal and social responses to the original scandal had been inadequate to address the underlying problems that had allowed the Brotherhood to develop and flourish. Modern forensic analysis of the remains found in the Pemberton Estate Chamber has provided additional insights into the Brotherhood's practices and their impact on victims. The physical evidence confirms that the ceremonies involve actual corpses rather than symbolic representations, while chemical analysis of artifacts found at the site suggests that the Brotherhood used various drugs and substances to control and manipulate its victims. The discovery of personal items belonging to known victims has also allowed researchers to trace the long-term consequences of Brotherhood involvement more precisely. Many of the women who participated in the ceremonies appear to have suffered from chronic health problems and psychological disorders that persisted throughout their lives, while their families experienced social and economic disruption that lasted for generations. What do you think really happened here? Weave your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale, subscribe, hit the bell, and share with someone who loves history's darkest mysteries. See you in the next video. The legacy of the Quiet Brotherhood serves as a reminder of how quickly the veneer of civilization can conceal practices that violate our most fundamental moral principles. In an era when we often look back at the 19th century as a time of clear moral certainties and social stability, the Brotherhood's activities reveal the darker currents that flowed beneath the surface of respectable society. The organization's success in operating for years without detection demonstrates how social authority and respectability can be used to shield the most horrific forms of exploitation and abuse. The Brotherhood's members were not outcasts or criminals in the conventional sense, but pillars of their communities who used their positions of trust and influence to prey upon the most vulnerable members of society. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the possibility that similar organizations continue to exist today, hidden within the structures of modern society and protected by the same combination of wealth, influence, and social respectability that shielded the Brotherhood from justice. The techniques of psychological manipulation and social control that the Brotherhood pioneered have only become more sophisticated in the intervening centuries, while the vulnerabilities that made the mill girls such ideal victims persist in new forms among modern populations. The story of the Quiet Brotherhood ultimately serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members from those who would exploit their desperation and isolation. It reminds us that evil often wears a respectable face, and that the greatest threats to human dignity and freedom may come not from obvious criminals, but from those who hold positions of trust and authority within our communities. As we continue to uncover new evidence about the Brotherhood's activities and their lasting impact on American society, we are forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of power, authority, and moral responsibility that remain as relevant today as they were in 1837. The Brotherhood may have been a product of its particular time and place, but the human capacity for both evil and complicity that it represented transcends any single historical period. The 13 coffins found beneath the Pemberton estate stand as silent witnesses to crimes that shocked a nation and challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of civilized society. They remind us that the price of freedom and human dignity is eternal vigilance against those who would exploit our trust and prey upon our vulnerabilities, regardless of the respectable masks they may wear or the positions of authority they may hold.